Okay, everybody. We're going to start now with a session about creating responsive websites and a few other things too. And I'm Daniel, for those who don't know me yet, and this is Raphael, who's going to assist me in this. So yeah, we're starting with a little window which has rearranged the logo a little bit. And so the topic is strategies, methods, and tips. We're not going to go into explicit like which CSS command is going to be ideal for what, because an hour is just too short for that. But I want to give you all these really, really important things which will then help you put everything into context. So the goal is really to empower you guys to create awesome solutions that are responsive. And also give you some tools, some documents, things like that, so that you can do it. And we're going to use some examples from Ricardo. Ricardo is a little bit like eBay, and it's like these auctioning websites. They've kind of split up. Some countries, for example, where eBay is really strong, all the other competitors just left because it didn't make sense. In other countries, for example, in Switzerland, Ricardo is very strong, and so eBay left. We're also going to use some examples from the IOR. So you guys probably know it as the Vatican Bank. And this is us, just so you know who's actually talking here. It's my team. We're 18 people, and we've been creating web solutions since 1999 with DNN since about 2003. So we're going to start with some real demos first, just so you understand the situation. And we're going to first look at it from the end user experience. First, some examples from the Vatican Bank, and then some examples from the Ricardo. So, Rafael, could you just go ahead and switch over to the IOR website? What you see here is, I guess the font rendering is a bit terrible, but that has to do with Windows running inside an Apple, etc. If you would be looking at this on a normal screen, you would notice, first of all, for example, that the logo is high resolution. It's retina optimized, so on tiny screens it looks really great too. Of course, if you change the screen size, that's the common thing that everybody knows. It'll behave differently at some point. The menu will disappear. It'll be replaced with a hamburger, and you'll just have this normal use case. If you could switch over to About Us, for example. Yep, About IOR, and let's hope the internet doesn't give up on us here. Then if we scroll down a bit, there's some statistics, key figures here. You'll also notice that tables, they're a very big problem with responsive websites. If you make the screen tiny, we've implemented a solution here which is actually very simple but works effectively, simply by providing a visual cue when there's not enough space so that people know they can slide sideways to look at some more. Then if we go up to another example, like on media, we have various pictures. If you guys, by any chance, are in the wireless, it probably would help if you were not. Well, might not make it. We'll try it again in a few seconds. In the other tab, we have a website from Ricardo, and this has not loaded yet. Okay, here we go. What you see here is, can you go full screen for a second? Amongst others, an image rotator, but it's having some real trouble displaying this. Okay, we have something with an image rotator here. We have little elements at the bottom, and of course, obviously, if the screen size changes, there's some problems we're going to run into. For example, the text there is just going to get too big for the picture, Other things are going to happen, like we can't keep those side by side, the blue boxes. The right pane just has no more space left. So of course the behavior has to adapt to all this. So if we go smaller, way too small, then for example, the image rotator will completely rearrange itself. It'll actually hide some information which we say, like some teaser text, which we say they're nice, but they're not that important.
It's not the website.
Is it the virtual machine?
Yeah.
Okay. In about a second or two.
I might have to restart it.
Okay, then let's wait with that for a moment. Can we still go back to Chrome? It might have kind of caught itself now. Yeah. You'll see now that the gray area, which was previously on top of the picture, has moved down. Some text has gone away. The blue boxes have rearranged themselves, things like that. So this is from the end user experience. Now, of course, this is just how we do quick simulations. In reality, people are not going to take a browser and just make it big and small and big and small. So our core need, of course, is that it just works on the small devices. Okay, so we're going to look at it now. Yeah, maybe you can try reloading the Vatican Bank example again. Maybe it's going to do it now. But the next thing we're going to look at is from the point of view from the user experience from our customer, who is the one that owns the website and needs to change these pictures. And if we could quickly log on to, if you go to the slides, there's a second address I'd like to show first. The next slide.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Something's wrong. Yes.
We'll work on that. Can you...
Yeah.
Just for the presentation.
Yeah.
That sounds like a good idea. DNN Connect Web Demo to SIGNet. What I'm going to show now is more or less the default installation the way you guys unpack DNN. Because it has a layout which, if you look at it at first, it feels responsive. And I mean, the great thing is that they finally started doing these things in DNN. But in reality, it doesn't really work if we can get it to load. So I actually do think this is the internet connection.
Yes.
Is somebody from OPSI here? Could you maybe find out if we could? Yep, because yep, and then default /default. Okay, I think it's working right now. Matteo, I think it's working. Yeah. Yeah. So you guys know this layout, and what is nice is, of course, it's also more or less responsive. If we would resize the screen, the image rotator changes behavior and everything, and it kind of makes you think, okay, this is the way we want it, right? Except that to edit this is basically impossible. If we go and try to, let's say, add some more pictures to this list, then you would typically go to this element and say, I just want to edit the content, and it's going to fail. Because technically, this is some very specific HTML you have to write, and it's basically not possible for a normal secretary to do this. So the implementation, if you look at it, there's a funny numbering up there, then the pictures just appear in a WYSIWYG. And if you look at the source code in HTML, you will notice there's all these classes attached to each node and things like that. So in other words, this is something that looks like it's made for a secretary, but you have to be a web designer to operate it. So it just doesn't work. On the other hand, let's try the way we think it should be done. So this is just a quick copy of the system that we just made for today. So there's going to be some licensing warnings on it, but don't worry about that. It's because they have the DNN Professional otherwise in use, and of course if we quickly stage it, it's going to complain. So Rafael's going to log on now. And we're going to make a new page, or you already made a new page, I believe.
Yes.
And so now we're going to simulate an almost identical scenario. You have a secretary that needs to put in some content like this, and it has to be responsive. So let's add just a little bit of text with a picture. Because even this is challenging to a secretary. Because the choice, for example, how it behaves, how the picture will scale, whether it'll go on top of the text or under the text once things start happening, these things have to be specified in the HTML, and a secretary cannot do this. But in this kind of a case where the content has templates as well, it's very simple. So yeah, just go ahead and edit something. And I'm sorry about the resolution here. And some picture. By the way, for those who haven't heard it yet, I heard the Telerik components are going to go away from DNN. So I'm very curious what's going to happen next, but I hope we're going to hear about more of that today. We'll see. Huh? Telerik. Yeah. In the current distribution, it's still included. Okay, so if you look at this, and if you look at the background, of course, you have all the correct HTML that you need for wrapping. How about you add another, like an image rotator?
You mean this one?
No, I think it's called home something. Slider home.
Yeah.
Yeah, for example, this is the same thing. This is the slider. This is something, I mean, it's the same concept like the one on the wannabe responsive DNN website. It's a picture that goes back and forth. It might have a bit of text. But this is something a secretary can edit because she just has to choose the data that is displayed and it just works. And I think that's the key behind all of this. These things are very difficult to do for normal people. So to make it responsive doesn't, I mean, if we're going to say it's responsive but it needs a web designer to operate, well then you barely even need DNN anymore. I mean, then you could just create it in Dreamweaver. And so this is key. Okay, so let's go look at the topics we have to cover to get these kind of things to work. Okay, so here's an overview in 3 minutes. First of all, the layout is actually the easy part. Most people think they should buy a responsive layout and then all the problems are taken care of. That's not the case. The layout is the easy part, especially because there's so many examples out there that you can just take one of them, adapt it a little bit, and get going. Responsive images are also not a big deal nowadays, or even retina images. We're going to show you some very, very simple solutions which barely cost you any time whatsoever to implement. The hard stuff is the real content. including questions like, yeah, how do I get it to work with all those tiny little details that have to be applied in the content templates. Tables, user input is really hard. User navigation is actually really, really hard because there's just no space on the screen. Multi-column content is nasty because people like filling their computer screens with information, so it has to be like side by side. And wrapping that properly is really tricky. Applications and animations get even worse. The concept or the process is pretty simple. Think about what you're going to do before you start. We're going to give you a few examples on how to do this, but you can easily waste weeks of work simply by just starting. Then implement the layout, test that of course, then implement the content and test that too. There's 2 or 3 things I'd just like to say about responsive and adaptive. I'm just going to ask someone randomly that feels comfortable with English. Difference, responsive, adaptive? Any idea?
Server client.
Okay. So server client, that's more or less it. And if you'll research it, there's a few confusing opinions out there, but in general, adaptive is when the server takes care of some of the changes, and responsive is when it's just the client. So if you just have some rules that say, if the screen is too small, then please wrap it, that's responsive. If you have a rule that says, if it is a mobile telephone, then send it some different HTML, then it's adaptive. Responsive is usually the way to go, and when you need more sophisticated, complicated things, you can enhance it with adaptive. Microsoft used to have a kind of an idea that you could just go adaptive, but it just doesn't work.
When you're relying on a mobile device will never turn into a desktop device the same moment. So that's something you can resolve on the server. But if you care about the screen size, of course, the user might switch to the screen size, even on a mobile phone. So that might be something where it's better to do it, or it's usually something which is better to be done on the client side.
Yeah, there's use cases for both scenarios, but I would at the moment claim 90–95% is responsive. It's also that it takes a lot of work to do the server-side stuff, a lot of work, and a lot of testing, and you get new devices. So it's just more work than doing it responsive. And so there are clear cases where it's worth the extra work, but in general, you'll be going responsive. So, some basics, use a CSS framework. We've been using YAML for about 6 or 7 years now. We're happy with it, but since DNN has finally used one in their default templates, I'm believing Bootstrap is probably going to be the future. Font scaling is always something you have to worry about a little bit, and you need a good tool to separate content from layout. We think the one we made, our open source Too Sexy Content, is the best for this. I actually don't even know any reasonable alternatives, but of course you could technically use any kind of a tool which allows you to separate data from the template. I'll go to this a little later. Layout, I would like to start and say you really need to plan some breakpoints. Breakpoints are moments where your layout is going to change a lot of behavior or presentation. To put it this way, if you have a screen that's like 1,000 pixels wide, and at 990 you would start changing the title size, and at 970 you may change the logo a little bit, and at 950 you may adapt a little bit of a box, and then you'll remove some margins. If you keep changing things at every level, it'll become very, very difficult to plan everything because too many things can change, and the content will keep on changing its width in so many ways that it's very hard to plan all those hundreds of CSS rules if you don't use breakpoints. And a breakpoint is just a way that the web designer will say, at this moment I'm going to use different rules. So if it's really tiny, the logo is going to stay the same size. Then maybe in the second segment the logo might grow slowly, and in the third it's going to stay fixed again but a larger size. You have a question?
Yeah, shouldn't there be 2 axes because you have a height size as well? I've had problems with building responsive websites where the width
Okay, so his input is that it may be valid to also have breakpoints in the height and to compensate for certain problems. I'm sure there are use cases for it. I think that most commonly nowadays nobody's planning for the height, but I agree that there are situations where it can be a problem. So planning these is very, very valuable, and it's like it'll help you run dry runs, test different scenarios. We love doing it in Balsamic. Then, we're still on paper here. We still continue on paper. We define the breakpoints. And then we still continue on paper because we actually spend a lot of time saying, between these two breakpoints, how should it behave? So before we even start implementing it, we'll say, okay, we have this size, which is typical for a tablet. And we plan every detail, every menu, every breadcrumb, every container, all through, because they usually have side effects. The breadcrumb needs some space, this needs space, and if you don't plan that ahead, you'll be tweaking this continuously. And it'll just take so much time because you'll tweak something, then you'll tweak something else, then you'll realize, okay, you're running out of screen space, then you'll tweak it again. And so this, we think, is extremely important. And we've printed 20 copies of this, and of course you can have the digital version too. But Rita, can you distribute this? It's just, we think this doesn't feel techie style. It's not so popular. But I'm convinced it's going to save you hundreds of hours of work. And yeah, since we don't have 20 copies, if possible, see if you can at least share in the company. And yeah, digital versions available too. Okay, some implementation tips. Raphael, maybe you can say something about the first one with the header, what that is for.
Yeah, basically this meta tag says to the device that that the user may not scale. He may not zoom in with 2 fingers on an iPhone, for example. And that the width of the website should be the device width. So if the device has a width of 320 pixels, then the website will be displayed in that width.
And if you don't have the tag, what kind of things can happen?
Yeah, the devices behave differently, but the iPhone, for example, will scale down the whole web page to be displayed very tiny.
Okay. Then the next thing is just we still have a few old browsers which don't understand all the rules we implement. Now there's always workarounds, but the general question is which of your CSS, which of your displays is the first one if the browser does not understand the rules. So typically you'll have a rule which says, for example, the layout is 1,000 pixels wide. But if the browser is smaller, then it'll be like that big. Now, if the browser doesn't understand these if the browser is smaller rules, then it'll show you the initial size. And especially if you have some old browsers, you may want to choose an initial size which is not as comfortable to develop with, not as perfect, but which just works. There's also JavaScript workarounds. But we've had customers where like they internally have IE8 installed on all systems, and that does force you to use a default which is not very popular. Then the last tip, sometimes you'll have situations where things have to rearrange a lot. And typically an easy way to do that is by writing some JavaScript which would say in this case, move the picture under the title. Or move it above the title. But this just can have a lot of side effects. If you want to know more, discuss it with Raphael, but in general, avoid that if possible. So let's look at the navigation. We have a lot of options for that. I guess one of the hardest things is that if the screen is so small, people somehow need to know where they are without using up the screen for them. Here are some of our favorites. Of course, the off-canvas menu is something everybody's seen a lot with the hamburger to display it. What we kind of, I don't know whether, I haven't seen it elsewhere, but we sometimes also create breadcrumbs which collapse. That means when the screen is super tiny, we don't show the entire breadcrumb, we just show the last like 2 knots of it. So the people still kind of have a context where they are, and they can always open up the breadcrumb to see the rest. We're doing this because customers tend to have rather long page names, and they could get rather deep, and we would just run out of screen space on a small device if we would show the entire breadcrumb. What we also like doing is we like reducing the amount of pages on a website. From the old days, you know the concept where you had like all these tiny pages with 4 lines of text in one picture. And of course this causes the user to have to navigate a lot. So what we like doing is saying, okay, this thing could have a sub-page, but we might as well also just collapse it into a little section. So it's like the user has the index on one page, he can open, close them if he wants to, and he doesn't have so many page changes while he's navigating through the website. This makes our tree a little smaller, which is great again for the breadcrumb, and is much more elegant to use for the normal user. Then again, content navigation. In other words, providing big buttons in the content to drill down. Very easy to do, and it's just much more finger capable than trying to force people to find their way through pop-up menus or things like that. So here are some tools we like using. The off-canvas things just need scripts that take care of this because you don't want to write this yourself. Our favorite at the moment is Cider. Anybody else have a different favorite they'd like to mention? Because there's a few, I think. No? Okay. And for example, image galleries, currently our favorite is Owl. It's just you always need these scripts which do nice things for you. And so Owl is our current favorite. The presentation, of course, will be available if you guys want this later. Then let's look at the content. Again, the hardest part is that we have very low-tech users which are going to update this content. And it almost always needs very special HTML markup, which is simply not possible in a WYSIWYG editor, unless, of course, you're a pro. But that doesn't count. So we need absolute control. We need full separation of data and presentation. And it's usually not enough to just say, I have all my texts. Usually you want to take the text apart down to every element. So if you have an address, you don't want to put that all in one text field. You want to have each piece of the address in a known element. This will also make it easier for you to use it as a Google map, to provide a vCard download or things like that, because you just know exactly what the information is. It'll also allow you to make a semantic markup, which some systems already recognize, be it Google, or in the future, hopefully, mobile devices and things like that too. So I mean, the goal, of course, is that you could see an appointment on a website, and if you touch it, it would add it to your calendar. So here's an example. Do you have any chance of increasing what we see here? Because it's since it's all pixely, it's a little difficult. Okay, I think this should help. Shift F5.
Oh, sorry. Which one?
Shift F5. No, up some more.
Up?
No, I think. No, further down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Shift F5 doesn't work on Mac.
Okay.
I tried. No.
Okay, here we are. Yeah. So basically what we do nowadays is for every single way to visualize something. We create a template, either with tokens or with Razor. It's usually a question of where we're installing it. So if we're putting it on a big system where the customer wants full control of any code that goes on it, we use tokens. But of course it makes a lot of things much harder, like conditional templates. So in general, we have this template and we'll have all the CSS classes in it, and all we're doing is just inserting the correct little pieces of data in the right places. It's very easy to do. Any web designer can create this, and here's where it actually gets interesting. Without this kind of tool, we always need people that know DNN and that know .NET. And they're very hard to get, and I think most of you are looking, you're trying to hire, and it's hard. So anything we can do that uses more simple technologies and more technologies that look like standard WordPress HTML, it's easier to find people that can help you do it. And a good web designer is usually not a good .NET programmer. So this helps. So we have all these simple placeholders just to split in the information the way we need it. And all the other special things, the CSS classes and all that, are in the template. And yeah, as far as I know, our tool is the only tool that works in the way we were showing, that you can just say, I would like to add this, I would like to add that, and just do it. Most other tools tend to have the idea that the customer always wants a list of something and a details page. And we think that's usually not the case, or not for a lot of the content. But of course, there's alternatives, and they're good as well. Tomorrow, by the way, we're going to create a timeline app using this in 1 hour. Because again, this is the idea. There's so many cool free scripts out there that do really awesome stuff, and all we have to do is integrate them into DNN and give the user the ability to edit them, and then you get these fully responsive, cool, feature-rich tools almost for free. So let's look at some images. Retina. Who has done retina optimization? Anybody? Hands up. Who's done retina optimization on websites? Okay, 1, 2, that's it. 3. Okay. Could you tell me what a retina display is? Say again?
Basically, how it started, customers asking to keep up with iPads.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the iPads and the iPhones are the ones that brought it in. Basically, the device says something like, my screen width here is 320 pixels, but in reality, the device has 640 pixels. So if you just look at the device from itself, it pretends to be a 320 pixel device. It does this more or less for backward compatibility, and because otherwise things would get too tiny. But it has more pixels left. And so if you deliver a 320 pixel image here, it'll actually look fuzzy. I'm going to show you some examples afterwards. So the device claims to be a little smaller than it actually is. And a funny side effect is that if you have a full screen picture, you may need a bigger one on a small device than on a PC. So that presents us with some rather challenging problems, because it's not the correct answer to just say give it, the mobile device, a tiny picture, because it's the wrong answer. So here's just an example, and I'm glad we got the screen resolution right again. If you look at this, on the left side we have an example which is not retina optimized, and you'll see that like the word magazine or even the logo looks a bit fuzzy. And it's like people don't just notice this. They're not going to complain. But once you see it side by side, it's kind of embarrassing. And on the IOR, for example, we have a retina image. So even when you create a screenshot and you zoom it, it still looks nice. Here, same problem with photos. Retina optimized, not retina optimized. On these screens, it matters. And technically, there's a lot of ways you could work with this, and none of them really work yet. There's like different concepts to solve this in HTML5, but most of them are not implemented yet. or just in some browsers. Here's just an example of the source set attribute. It's an extension to the image tag. So in other words, we can really say there's no standard way of doing it today. But what we found recently, well actually a while ago, about 2 years ago, is that there's a pretty funky trick out there. If you take a picture and you make it twice as wide and twice as tall, then you can increase the JPEG compression by quite a bit, and it'll still look nice. The reason's pretty simple. If I'm standing here, I have all these surfaces that have like the same color, like I usually have kind of red cheeks. And so if my red cheek is only like 20 by 20 pixels, then the JPEG compression has 20 by 20 pixels to optimize, and then the color changes. If I double this, the JPEG compression has 40 by 40 pixels to optimize, but it's still more or less the same color. So I can increase the compression, and the picture will still look great. So actually, the totally simple solution is just deliver the pictures twice as big and increase the compression. And that's it. It works great. You'll have pictures that look great everywhere, and you will also have a file size which is comparable to the previous one. And you don't have to implement a lot of complicated logic or HTML5 tags which are not supported everywhere. So our recommendation for this and next year still is just do it the easy way. And just simply ignore all the options you have for device detection and things like that. We're hoping that within 1 or 2 years the situation will get better and you can optimize it some more. And of course there's some really extreme scenarios which are extremely picture intensive where you may want a different strategy, but this solves most problems that you can have. Here a simple example. This is a template again, and of course some CSS classes, and you'll see we're just picking the content photo there. It's about the 4th line of code. We're telling it that the width it should deliver is twice as big as our largest presentation size, and we were using a special cropping mode so that it always fills the square, and we're reducing the quality to 60, and this works great. So just so we've mentioned them, of course there are alternatives. There's JavaScripts which more or less try to simulate the tags like they should work in a few years. So there's ways of doing it. There's probably also scenarios where this makes sense, but so far we've just found it much easier and more elegant to just do what we just did. Okay, but delivering the right image, of course, isn't that simple. You need a very good image resizer, and you need a good portion of caching. Our favorite is the image resizer, imageresizer.net. I hope and believe most of you have used it. And in Too Sexy Content, we're delivering that, and we've included a tiny cache. It's a special cache, which is, it's like a little secret component, because the full cache, the really, really great cache, is like crazy, the way it's built. It's like made to handle millions of pictures in all kinds of sizes, and it's really extreme, but it's not free. So what I've discovered is a lot of people are using the professional cache because you can just download it and use it, and they're not paying for it because they don't realize that it's actually something you'd have to pay for. But there's a tiny cache included. It's from the same company, and of course the disk cache, it's a license you pay as a service provider, so we pay about $1,000 a year, and if you create a few websites, it's affordable. So I would go for the disk cache, but for anybody who has to check his wallet a second time, use a tiny cache. So content, same problem, plan first. First of all, just creating the nice content types that people can work with them isn't that easy. And just as a general tip, people will try to start with something like a content type called video. And they'll have a title, and a video URL, and a description. And then they'll suddenly realize they need this video, for example, for training purposes, and then they'll add a document field to the video content type. And a little later they'll think, okay, I also need a link field, and I also need a field for an extra description, and suddenly you have something that was called video, which has a lot of fields, and you have to leave a lot of them empty depending on which way you're presenting them. That's usually the moment where you want to change the strategy and make different content types, because it'll be very confusing for your user. Okay? Then planning the templates has same problems like with the layout. When you have clear breakpoints in your layout, it's much, much easier to plan the content templates. Because you always have to remember, you'll have like a scenario where the content pane gets smaller and smaller, and then suddenly you're going to remove the menu on the side. Suddenly the content pane gets bigger again. And if you have a lot of these things, if you have 3 breakpoints, you have 3 scenarios that you have to cover, and it's easy to plan with. But if you remove and add something every few pixels, you have a lot of scenarios to cover with your content templates, and it gets very difficult, especially because you usually cannot make the content rules based on the content pane size. You're usually forced to calculate based on the screen size. It's some limitations with CSS, and so it makes things very confusing if you don't have all those breakpoints in place. Okay? Tables. Tables in general show data, and that's something that's very difficult on tiny screens. Our current recommendation is there's this cheap version which simply stops the table from shrinking when you run out of space, and just provides a visual cue that you can scroll sideways. This is something that works for a lot of things. It's not very difficult to implement, and it's a little generic. Now, of course, if you have really, really difficult tables, like you're comparing 2 products, there are, of course, more sophisticated strategies, but this is just the simple one-size-fits-almost-all solution, which will just get you through it. So, yeah, our favorite, by the way, is just to provide a fade out on top of the table, because then on your mobile device you'll see it kind of continues and people can work with that. Yeah, if you have more complex solutions, you'll go for other options like wrapping the columns then themselves, or freezing certain rows or columns so it just works better. But much more complicated and much more difficult for your editor to update data then, because it's so much more complex. Multi-column content is another tricky point. Here we have a solution or a situation where the content editor wanted a start page with different like blog introductions, and depending on how these are actually aligned in the HTML, they will wrap differently. For example, you could just wrap them linearly. You could also say the entire right pane slips under all the others. Because if you create 2 panes with this, then of course you can't just mix them when the screen size changes, because of the DOM structure. Here's a scenario where it's still kind of obvious that it could work, but actually you have much more difficult situations like this. Because the primary question is, what is the reading sequence for the user? Is it left to right, left to right, left to right, or is it down and down? And in this situation, for example, it gets a little trickier because it's not quite obvious which way the user should be reading. And once you even want to wrap across multiple modules, there's basically almost no other way than to use some JavaScript. The one thing we said, try to avoid. There's always some ways to kind of get it to work, but if the editor wants a lot of control over this, it will become tricky. So, rule number 1, try to get the panes to work as a whole, because mixing elements from different panes will get very, very difficult. Then a general tip as well is, not everything you have on a big screen is that important. So a very common trick is also just removing stuff. And of course, there's always people that think this is important, but you do have to make compromises. And one of the compromises could be to remove some things on a tiny screen so that the other elements work out better. There's also always the option of shrinking things. So you'll have something like maybe a big title and a lot of text on a big screen, and when it becomes tiny, you just fold the content. The title's still there, he can click on it if he really wants it, but it doesn't have to be a 70-page iPhone scrolling thingy. And again, when things get really nasty, you're going to have to use some JavaScript for rearranging it in the DOM, unfortunately. Animations. In general, I'm assuming I'm talking to people that prefer programming in .NET than in JavaScript. So the general rule is try to not do it yourself. There's amazing free scripts out there, whether it's galleries, whether it's cool picture changers. I'd like to show you one quickly. Does Ricardo, the live website, work?
We could try.
Verkäuferportal.
Which page?
I think there's one about photography. Try this one.
Here?
No, go back. It was in the slider. There was
Okay.
the second slide, I believe, is about photography. Mm-hmm. And now if you would just unfold the things under it, one of them has two pictures that are compared.
Do you know where?
Nope. Okay, quickly go to the editing interface. You can just add one there.
Okay. Here.
Yeah, add a module. You have a pretty high zoom here.
No, it's the resolution.
Okay.
This one?
Yeah. Yeah, and just edit some data.
Okay.
Or you can just get out of edit mode. It has some demo data and it'll work too.
Okay.
If you can get out of edit mode.
Yes. How should I do that?
Okay, here. This is a very simple before and after template. Takes you half an hour to choose between 3 or 4. And this one also already supports touch, and it corrects its behavior for everything. So this is a typical free lunch. All you need to do is provide a simple user interface where the secretary can specify which 2 pictures, and that's it. So in general, if you want to do something, there are so many free, cool plugins, JavaScripts, whatever, that do all these tiny little things for you. And my recommendation is, if this is not the thing you're really comfortable with, don't even bother trying to do it yourself. You're going to forget so many devices and problems that somebody else already took care of. Okay. Yep. And if you really have to do something yourself, remember, use the frameworks, because again, you'll mess up otherwise. It's just too difficult. Okay, let's see, we're almost done. User input. Very nasty on tiny devices. So, yep. Most devices have special helpers, like for picking a date. And very often, if you use a cool framework like jQuery UI, you'll have problems that they want to provide an extra interface for entering data. And this often causes the optimize the interface, which the device has, to not work. So this is tricky. Then for registration, things like that, always remember it's really a big hassle to enter an address. So if you can find any way to avoid that, do it. And reduce the amount of fields you want. I mean, mostly people like to know a lot of things about their customers, but again, it's just a big problem with if you're doing this on mobile devices. And the last one is probably the hardest to figure out, because if you can offer the user a way to finish his process on a different device, this may actually be the easiest way of doing it. He's in the bus, he found what he wants, now he maybe just needs to send himself an email home instead of trying to order it from his tiny device. So, just on time. That's a Swiss for you. That's it. So, questions? Yes, Sasha.
Do you manage also some breakpoints from touch device and no touch device?
So your question is whether we differentiate the breakpoints depending on if the device has touch or not. No, at the moment we don't. No. Because at least the way we do it, we make sure that it would work on any device, because also we don't know if big devices use touch or not. Yes?
Do you have any detection that an iPad stops animations when you scroll?
Yep.
Do you have any detection for that?
Okay, this is a rather common problem. Maybe you could quickly show it on the I/O. We can't. It's hard to simulate on a computer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The problem we have here is that when you're scrolling, there's an event that's fired, a JavaScript event, which says, I'm scrolling. And sometimes if you have like floating elements that maybe need to scroll along or something, you need this event to reposition things on the screen. And the problem is though that at least the iPhone and the iPad device don't fire the event until it's done. So if you scroll fast, you might lose the menu hamburger, and it won't be there until you stop scrolling, and then you have to somehow make sure it comes back. And that's the question you have, is whether we have like a special event to handle that.
What do you do to solve that?
Yeah. Okay. Could we quickly show the IOR site, the live one?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Where is it?
So if you see here, if the screen gets smaller, we're going to replace it with a hamburger. And here's actually the problem. If the hamburger could stay where it is right now, then it wouldn't be a big deal. But it needs to be here for the start page because it's aligned to the logo, but later on we want it further up. So if we scroll down, we make it to come slide down like that, and you'll see it looks different now. And that's the problem. It needs JavaScript to change the look, so we can't just do that with CSS. And no, there's absolutely no workaround for that. We just added an animation so it looks like we did it on purpose. Yeah. More questions? Yes. Retina. Yeah. Yeah.
So do you resize that with CSS for the different token items? How do you get the size in the box?
Okay, so your question is, how do we, if the picture's like too big, how do we get it to be the size we want to? Well, in general, since we're doing this responsive anyways, actually the size of the picture will change depending on the resolution, depending on the size. So basically those rules are in CSS already, yes. For each template we have to define rules for each breakpoint, how it's going to behave. Yes, and usually it'll have a specific class because depending on the visual arrangement it'll have a different rule. Yeah. And maybe an additional note on this, because using retina with a double size has a minor side effect if you're using CSS sprites. Who in here uses CSS sprites or image sprites? 1.5, 2, 3. Who knows what it is? Still not enough. Who doesn't know what it is? Hands up. At least 3 or 4 or 5. Okay. You all know the strategy probably that DNN has if you have a lot of JavaScript files, so that it'll pull them all together so you just have one file that's retrieved. And DNN does a pretty good job at that. And the goal behind it is to not have a ping pong of requests with a bunch of tiny files which take too long, but to actually just have one request and deliver everything. Now, with pictures, you can't just do it that way. But you can go a similar way. You can take a bunch of pictures and put them into one image. And then you can say, let's just pretend the logo is done that way. Then you can say, that thing there has a background which comes out of the picture with all the tiny pictures. And the background starts here. And that way, especially for all the tiny buttons you'll have, it's a very important strategy to reducing the amount of pictures you'll transfer. It makes a huge impact on performance, on the felt performance of the user. Now, when you're working with backgrounds, there's a few side effects. I'm not sure, does it not work or if we do retina? Or do you have to use special rules again?
If I remember correctly, you have to specify alternative background positions for retina devices, for retina images.
Exactly, because of course you're not really starting, you have all these icons aligned in one picture, and let's say they're all 100 by 100, and normally you would say, well, you're starting at position 400, 200 because you want this icon, but of course on a retina you have way more pixels, and the devices handle this differently. So you need to add more rules with media detection, I believe, to get that to work. Yes?
Just a comment. I don't know who's heard of Stevie, S-T-E-Y. It's a Google initiative to change the way that data is transferred between certain browsers so that it goes as a single stream. So if that becomes more popular, I think about 2% of websites supported at the moment, then that issue in terms of number of assets being transferred and the impact on performance will be vastly reduced. So it's definitely one to watch and see how that develops over the next couple of years.
Okay, thanks for the input. More questions? Yes?
You showed a rotator with text on it. When you ask the end user to enter text to show on that image, you probably need to show like 5 input fields for different sizes of the screen and ask them to re-input the same text in a shorter version. Do the customers understand what part of their text they need to leave out, and you really think this is something a customer will be able to
Mm-hmm.
secondary?
So his question is if we'd like have an image rotator or something with a limited space of text, and if we would implement it so that there's like different lengths of the text so that we would show a different text every time, whether the customer is able to figure out how that works. And basically, I think my first answer is it would be possible, but I think I wouldn't follow that strategy. I think it's too confusing. And since you are going to have the same sentence in the HTML, then almost the same one 4 times, I think it's not a good strategy. I would rather say then follow a way of either shrinking the text if the screen gets too small, or hiding it, or doing a cut and then ... But in general, the special thing is also, typically, if you open DNN nowadays, you have 40-something modules. And of course, that feels like you need a lot of training. But in most cases, the customer only has exactly those 7 templates he's allowed to use. And so that actually makes training rather simple. If you had such a special case, it would work. Mm-hmm. More questions? Yeah?
So how much of this pain does your modules take out? Do your modules replace some of this coding, or do your modules make it simpler, or what is it?
Yeah. You still need the web designer, that creates the template the first time, because you need the CSS classes and the module can't do that for you. But then making sure that the user content is in there, well, there's actually no other option that I know of at the moment.
So your module, you make the template for your module, is that correct? And then you put the content into your module by template?
Yeah, you define a bunch of templates, you define content types, and then the user just says, just like Raphael did, okay, here I would like to add a picture compare, and then the user has 4 fields to fill in, and it's automatically multilingual, it's all versioned, you can have an unpublished save, it's pretty feature-rich in the background. Yeah. More questions? Okay. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Does your module have the ability to say, I want to show if we're on a different device? Can you decide whether that module shows or not? Have you got any control over that stuff?
Well, the way we would do it usually is within the CSS class. Again, because, for example, there are scenarios where you may not want to show it like this, but you do want to show it like that. So it has to be transferred for that to work. Otherwise, since the templates, for example, if you use Razor, I mean, that's .NET. So you can also access the devices database or whatever to find out what device it is if you need to. So that is easy to do. But it kind of doesn't have anything to do with our module because it's just C# Razor. Yeah?
Just say there's a session on that technique tomorrow morning. Doing what you just asked.
Cool. Yep. So to repeat that, he's going to have a session tomorrow on handling some more server-side adaptions for the templates. Yeah. Good. Yes, Benoit?
Yes, we're going away from the WYSIWYG philosophy that was the flagship of DNN when it was launched 10 years ago. So why not push the concept further and have a back office like we had 10 years ago, where I could manage all my content outside the DNN website. So the editor, the secretary, would feel it's much easier because she wouldn't see all these menus and all these options, and she wouldn't have to go to each page to edit the Too Sexy Content module one by one. And what do you think about this idea that you might go back to a back office completely outside the DNN website to manage all the Too Sexy contents?
Yeah. So Benoit is asking if now we're kind of getting rid of the WYSIWYG, whether we may also get rid of the, let's say, in-page editing. And I personally think that for the kind of websites we're talking about here, the in-page editing is extremely valuable because people know I mean, just finding the right data to edit would be difficult in a backend. I've seen it, a lot of PHP CMSs have a backend, and it makes it very hard to just figure out where the data is that you're going to change. But of course, for very, very large-scale websites like newspapers, there is no other way than with a backend because you don't really care what page it's on. You're just editing the data. But I believe the kind of websites we create, we need this just so the user even knows what he's editing. Yes? Perfect. Yes, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.